Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Learning from Null Effects, a Bottom-Up Approach. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us, and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. Alrababa'h is an assistant professor in social and political sciences at Bocconi University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Immigration Policy Lab and received his Ph.D. in political science from Stanford University. His research focuses on authoritarian media, political violence, and immigration and refugees. Scott Williamson is an assistant professor in social and political sciences at Bocconi University. His primary research agenda focuses on the popular politics of authoritarian regimes, particularly in the Middle East. He also studies the causes of prejudice and strategies for prejudice reduction, focusing on perceptions of migrant communities and the work on projects advocating for new approaches to increasing transparency and reducing biases in the publication process. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for inviting us to speak. As you mentioned, Scott and I will be talking about this paper. The paper came out in Political Analysis a few years ago, and the title is Learn About Null Effects, Bottom-Up Approach. Only a few days ago, I saw this tweet as I was preparing with Scott for this presentation, and I thought it's actually a great way to start and motivate this presentation. So we're both political scientists, but also this, I would argue, applies largely to most of the social sciences, at least. So the tweet mentioned, since political science doesn't really publish null results, I wonder how much time, energy, money has been wasted on people independently studying the same or similar ideas, only to learn the same lesson. I would love to see the journal of don't bother, we already tried that. And I really think this is a great motivation for this paper. So essentially, we know that there's a lot of research that has been conducted over the last decades that has not really been observed. So the researchers or scholars cannot observe the full set of research designs that have been conceptualized, implemented, and analyzed. And this is due to several reasons. One is lack of transparency around planned research. Maybe there's planned research, people plan this research, but don't implement it or don't tell us what their research plans are. There's definitely a problem of selective reporting and publication of scientific findings. So not all findings have equal chances at publication. Maybe there are some good reasons, but also there are some reasons to do with the specific findings themselves. And this also leads to biases in what we can observe. Of course, there's the difficulty of the publication process, and this is possibly even increasing over time. And then scholars may also lack interest in their own projects if they have null findings. So if people conduct an experiment, for instance, or a study, they find null results, then the scholars themselves may decide not to publish these findings too. And there has already been some existing research and arguments made by scholars about the consequences of unobserved research. We know that null results in particular are less likely to be reported or published in the social sciences as well as in other disciplines. And this is actually quite problematic. It has some negative consequences in terms of the accumulation of knowledge that we have. So the reported effect sizes are likely biased upwards. And the idea here is, if you think about it, we're interested in the effect of X on Y. Say there have been several studies of the effect of X on Y. And when the effect is significant, these studies are public. When the effect is not significant, these studies are not public. So the knowledge that scholars will get is that the effect of X on Y is significant. And that's because only these studies get published. The fact that maybe there have been even more studies saying that X does not lead to Y, or there's no clear relationship between the two. But if these studies are not published, then this really biases the knowledge that we accumulate. And this basically makes our efforts to evaluate what we know or we don't know. This really misses some important information because these null results are much less likely to be published and reported by scholars. This is also problematic because this could lead to time, energy, and resources wasted on study designs and so on that might have been implemented differently with more complete information. So if you think back about the tweet we mentioned, okay, maybe somebody has studied this, the effect of X on Y, conducted an experiment, found that the results are null, did not report them, did not publish them. Then somebody later does the same thing, doesn't publish the results, and so on. People are wasting time, energy, resources on studies that maybe we do know the answer. Maybe there's no effect of X on Y, but we would have known this much earlier if the null results are published. So this is quite a problem for us. So as a result, the lack of publication or the fact that null results are much less likely to be published and reported in scholarship, it makes it much more difficult for researchers to build cumulative. We'll show one example. We know that across the social sciences, there's a lot of interest in studies on nudges. So can we maybe change human behavior on certain aspects with small nudges? What we did for this paper to demonstrate the extent of this problem is we found every single study on nudges that was registered on the American Economic Review website. And we found 34 studies that had not null results that were either published in academic journals or at least as working papers. We found only one study with null results that was published as a working paper. We couldn't find any studies with null results published as in peer-reviewed journals. And then there were 40 other studies that were not published. So once again, we started with all the designs on the American Economic Association's website. We found this many designs. Of those designs, 40 were not published, and the vast majority, with the exception of one study that was published as a working paper, all the other studies had significant or not results. The thing is, what can we conclude from this research? Do not just work. Based on the published or working papers, they seem to really work. But if you assume that all not published studies were null results, then not just don't seem to work very well. But we cannot really assume that either. We simply don't know what happened to these studies. Maybe they had null results. Maybe they did not have null results. In terms of the conclusion, do not just work, we have no idea because we really should know what happened to these 40 studies that were not published. If most of them were significant, then not just work. If most of them were null results, then not just don't seem to work really well, but we really don't know. So this is really the problem that we're dealing with in this research. There has been a lot of focus over the last maybe 15 years on research credibility. We know that the credibility revolution and the social sciences has tried to address some other very important challenges of knowledge accumulation. So now there's a lot more transparency of research that deals with pre-registration and making sure that scholars, before they conduct experiments or sometimes even observational studies, they pre-register their designs. We also care much more now about the availability of data, reporting and replication, making sure that the data and the code are available for researchers. But these improvements, they really improve the transparency of results in many ways, but they still do not address this problem of null results, right? The lack of reporting null results in the first place. Even, when there's a pre-registration but no paper published, it could mean that this paper was null results, or it could mean that something else happened. We don't know. When people are publishing their data and code as well, this really improves the replication process. Maybe we're more likely to trust the results. But then again, this is conditional on the results being published. But if scholars are not publishing null results, then there's still a serious limitation in terms of the transparency of research and results. Why do people not publish null results? So we already think this is a big problem, but so why has this issue not been resolved earlier? We think there are a few issues here. One, there's no clear incentive for researchers to publish null results. So writing a paper, I think we would all agree, is not a very easy process. There's a lot of cost of writing up a paper. And especially with null results, if we think that they're less likely to be published, which seems to be the case, then you're investing a lot of time writing up the paper with a very low return in terms of actually having the likelihood of this paper getting published. So this is a problem. And there's also a collective action issue here. So this is publishing null results is potentially helpful to the profession generally and to the cumulative knowledge, but it's potentially harmful actually for researchers. One, in terms of the time invested, again, thinking about the cost of writing up the results with a low return, but potentially maybe there is even a cost to reputation. So if researchers are designing a lot of studies and some of them potentially because of problems in the design or the theory or some other factors lead to null results, potentially these researchers' reputations could be undermined. And this is a norm that we also are trying to fight against here in this paper. Another problem is that there's a weak incentive for journals. One of the most prestigious journals in political science, the Comparative Political Studies, they had actually a special issue with results pre-publication. So the editors basically sent the research designs to reviewers, and based on reviewing the research designs, they decided to publish the papers or not, regardless of the results. And this happened in one issue, and then the editors mentioned that they were not interested in continuing this model. Why is this the case? They mentioned a few things for why this would be the case. One is that it may not publish simply based on design without looking into the results. It may not actually fully protect against data phishing. So people might still engage in data phishing and so on, even after reviewing their design only. And this could also increase the difficulty of reviewing the analysis adequately, because the reviewers don't only look at the design, but they look at the research strategy, the specific analyses, and the results. And this makes it very difficult to review these. This would also complicate the identification of important findings. So here, this is actually closer to the null results. Important findings are generally viewed as findings that are significant. And then if you really focus on the importance of the findings, then this would remove many null results from publication. And then another argument is that this could also inhibit the publication of non-experimental research by only focusing on research designs for experimental studies. So this is also another potential problem with this model. Another proposed solution is the Journal of Null Results, trying to establish maybe a prestigious journal of null results to try to incentivize more frequent publication of these studies. Scholars have discussed this for many years, but it's difficult to implement in practice. And in general, even starting any journal that will be prestigious enough is very difficult. It could take years. But also it's potentially difficult to find editors and reviewers for a journal that only focuses on the publication of null results and making this journal prestigious. And then the problem is not only in publishing null results, but how do you interpret these null results? So the null results could be precise, maybe this could be useful in some ways, but also the null results maybe are not very precise. And then how do you interpret these null results? The challenge is not only in lack of reporting, but even if null results were to be reported, it's very important to decide how to interpret these findings and how do you analyze these findings as well. So in the paper that we have, our goal is really to try to establish a new norm of getting null results reported and across the social sciences, not only in political science. And what we argue here is that the scholars should write and post online summaries of null findings that they do not want to publish through the peer review process. If scholars want to write the null results paper as a full paper, send it to a peer reviewed journal, that's great. That resolves the problem. The thing is, in most of the cases, this doesn't seem to be happening. In most of the cases, if people get null results, they simply don't report them. What we're suggesting instead is if they don't want to write full paper, then at least post an online summary of these null findings. And this idea here, it's an online summary. It's a very short summary, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a bit. But this should overcome some of the time constraints that scholars have. And also, if a lot of people do this, and we started doing this, and the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford and ETH Zurich now has a policy in terms of doing this. The idea is if more people do this, then this will hopefully also overcome some of the concerns about the reputation cost from publishing null results, even for studies that maybe are not necessarily very well designed. Maybe there were problems in the design or something, but at least it is useful for everybody else to learn from these issues in terms of helping them design later studies. As I mentioned, the Immigration Policy Lab has tried to develop a template for these null result reports. And these reports would be short. We argue that they could be approximately 5 pages. We try to not be very hard in terms of the page limit. So they could be a bit shorter or longer, but the idea is they don't need to be fully written papers. They don't need to be very difficult to write. They could be just very short reports. And several components from these reports would actually be taken already from the pre-analysis plans and the analysis that the scholars have done that they used to find null results. A lot of the parts of these reports would already be written anyway from the pre-analysis plans and then simply by doing the main analyses here. And the template outlines some and structures these pieces needed for a useful report in a way that would allow scholars to try to interpret these null findings, including even if there were issues in the design or something. We provide a template that would outline and structure these pieces in a way that would allow people to learn from these null results, essentially. So what does this template look like? So we argue that the null result report should include 4 main sections. One is the research design, and this is largely taken from the pre-analysis plan, so it doesn't need to change all that much. Another one is the basic findings or the main findings in the paper. So the scholars, to find the null results, they would have had to presumably run some regressions, and they can simply report these regression tables or figures here. And then in terms of interpreting these null results, in the template, we provide ideas for potential explanations that scholars should try to address. So those include issues related to statistical power. Maybe the study was not powered enough to detect the effects that were detected in the study. Potentially measurement strategies. So maybe some of the predictors or the outcomes could have been measured in better ways or something. So they have a space to talk about the measurement strategy. Potentially implementation issues. Scott and I have done experiments in many contexts, and very often implementation issues that we did not anticipate happen. And so this is an easy, quick space for scholars to discuss some of these implementation issues and how they may have complicated the findings. Another potential issue is related to spillovers and contamination. Maybe the control group unintentionally received a treatment. Maybe there was some spillover between the units. This is also a space that scholars would have to talk about spillover and contamination in this area. And then finally, maybe the theoretical priors were simply incorrect. Scholars hypothesized something and then they couldn't find support for these, which is also interesting. And I want to emphasize that really any of these, if you're later doing a study on a related issue, it would be important for you to know about the power, of course, and measurement implementation issues, try to avoid maybe some of the problems as well as spillover. But also it's very important to know about the theoretical priors. And maybe if we have a lot of studies testing the same thing, a lot of them tend to be null, then this can also allow scholars to revise their hypotheses and theories as well. So all of these would be very useful in terms of later implementation. And then finally, the 4th section of the null result report would be an implication for future studies. Once again, we are really focused on knowledge accumulation and trying to help future scholars or future research implement these designs in a way that's useful for scholars. So a short section would also discuss these implications for future studies, maybe what they should do or could they do better and so on to revise some of these findings. So I'm going to stop here and I'll give the microphone to Scott to start talking about some examples of these null results.
Great. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Ala, for the first part of the talk. Thank you for being here and for having us. So I'll go through 2 examples of how this has been applied, one in which we ourselves used it and one in which the framework was adopted in a published piece. And I'll then talk a little more about some reflections on how this might become a broader norm and further on some of the challenges that might be faced. In terms of the example that we ourselves implemented, we got this idea after running a survey in Jordan, where part of the goal was to understand strategies for trying to improve attitudes towards Syrian refugees among the Jordanian host population. As you probably know, when the Syrian civil war started in 2011 and 2012, there were hundreds of thousands of Syrians who fled south. Many of them are still there today. And basically in the span of a few years, you had almost 10% of the population moving into the country. As I'm sure you can imagine, though Jordan has been fairly welcoming by global standards, there have been tensions and issues with social cohesion in the country. Part of our goal in running the survey was to test several strategies that might help with this social cohesion. And to do that, we implemented a survey with 1,500 Jordanians, 1,200 as a nationally representative sample, and 300 that was concentrated in areas where there were more Syrians living. And so we had 3 interventions that were informed by the literature on what motivates charitable giving. So the idea here was that basically becoming more welcoming of people moving into your country might require you to give some time, energy, resources to help them basically set up their new lives. And so potentially this literature on what gets people to give could have some useful applications in this context as well. So we had one intervention that tried to highlight the needs of Syrians in terms of what they went through in Syria before coming to Jordan and the difficulties they faced as refugees living in Jordan. We had a second treatment that highlighted Islamic values about welcoming guests into your country, taking care of them, trying to link the way refugees are treated to broader values in the society. And the third tried to tap into this joy of giving that people often feel. When you donate or help someone, you might get some warm glow, a sensation that you've done some good, that people like, perhaps trying to emphasize to Jordanians how many Syrians are deeply grateful for the way that Jordan has treated them, would make the Jordanians more open to policies that would benefit the refugees, more supportive of the refugees as people. So these were the 3 interventions. Each one had about a paragraph of text that the enumerator would read to the survey respondent, and then a 2-minute video to really try and drive home the message. And here the enumerator would give the tablet to the respondent and they would watch the video. But after all that, we ended up with essentially null results. So here we had several different outcomes. I'll go into a little more detail about that in a minute. But here we have an index based on all of those outcomes. And you can see relative to the control group, we have essentially precisely estimated nulls, especially for values in need. There was a little movement on the joy treatment, but substantively, even if this had been statistically significant, it's a tiny shift. So in terms of the outcomes that we had, we asked about general attitudes towards Syrian refugees as people. We asked about perceptions of whether the refugees had impacted Jordan negatively or positively in a bunch of different ways, the economy, crime, etc. We asked, I believe, 4 questions about policy outcomes that would reflect more or less positive treatment of the refugees. And then we also tried to see if the Jordanians would be willing to volunteer to assist the refugees. So I'll just highlight that for attitudinal outcomes, policy outcomes, and volunteer outcomes, in general, we see small positive effects, but again, none of them are statistically significant. And then the impact one actually seems like these treatments, if anything, made Jordanians slightly more likely to see the impact as negative. But again, none of these effects are significant. If any of the treatments worked best overall, it might have been the joy of giving treatment, but there's nothing around which we can draw very firm conclusions. So in thinking about how to understand these null findings and why these strategies didn't seem to work, we first developed and then applied this template or this framework for thinking through, for diagnosing null effects. So was it a power issue? Probably not. We had done power analyses. We were well powered. Maybe if we'd had a larger sample, the joy treatment would have been significant. But again, substantively, the effect would have been quite small. In terms of measurement strategy, we used a variety of different outcomes, and these are standard in the literature, many of them. So we didn't see any issues here. We did uncover a potential implementation issue that I think has useful implications for other researchers. We were very excited about these videos. I think it's not very common to have a treatment that, especially in the context of a survey experiment, that has this much potential strength in terms of people sitting there and watching for 2 minutes, something about what refugees are going through or how grateful they are to be in the country. But in fact, the enumerators suggested that respondents seemed bored or uninterested in watching them, that even though they're only about 2 minutes, that this was too long. They often asked to skip them, which was not allowed or supposed to happen. So it may be that in some other format, this message would have an effect, but because of the medium through which the message was transmitted, it just didn't resonate with people going through the survey. And so again, that may be useful for researchers trying to do something similar in terms of prejudice reduction in the field in the future. Spillover and contamination, we had no reason to think that this would be a problem here. And then flaws and theoretical priors. Here again, we spent some time thinking through what we might have done wrong. Perhaps one conclusion we drew from this is perhaps strategies that provided genuinely new information or ways of thinking about the crisis would have been more effective than trying to prime emotions, which is essentially what the 3 treatments we gave were doing. And the reason we think that may have mattered is at the point we were implementing the survey, it was 7 years into the crisis. Many Jordanians are well aware of what's going on. They also probably have some sense of fatigue and exhaustion regarding the refugee issue. So just priming them on this, probably not going to do so much. But maybe if we had introduced a genuinely new way of thinking about what was happening, that would have had more effectiveness. So in discussing this, our hope is that researchers trying to design future studies in this field, which is quite crowded, has a lot of work on it, might benefit from that discussion. We also drew some implications from the finding that more broadly should be relevant as well. So it's further evidence. There's already quite a bit of it, but this is still important that changing attitudes on issues like views of refugees or other excluded groups or minorities is just very difficult and often deeply rooted in individuals' worldviews. So it's not something that's easy to change. In this literature, there's often more optimism about strategies that leverage emotion rather than factual information, for instance, in terms of changing attitudes. But we're showing here that these strategies didn't work. So again, perhaps there's some publication bias here where these strategies often seem more effective than they actually are. So it's important to put these null findings out there. And then there may be some implications for designing social cohesion programs here. Maybe don't try to use these messages, although here we'd be very cautious because, of course, we can't say if we'd used a different medium, if we'd implemented this in a different way, perhaps theoretically these mechanisms would still be relevant for attitude change on this issue. We wanted to be careful in how we talked about. Just to quickly go over one other way in which this framework has been implemented. This is a paper from 2023 that was actually published again in comparative political studies. It did quite well in the publication process. And the findings were primarily null, but he used the framework we talked about for diagnosing why that may be to understand the results. So what he was doing here was to look at whether priming Ugandans on more liberal laws towards LGBT people in neighboring countries and in Western countries would have them reevaluate their own attitudes towards LGBT people and policies in Uganda. And in the end, he found that it did not. Neither treatment really had an effect. The only effects that existed was some backlash in terms of perceptions of the countries in which were mentioned in the treatment. So here's his main set of findings. Again, the attitudinal and behavioral measures of prejudice towards LGBT people didn't really move, but then you do see some backlash here against both neighboring African countries and Western countries that were used in the treatments. He goes through that same set of considerations again. Was it underpowered? Likely not. It was fairly well powered. Again, he's using many different outcomes here, so it's probably not at all measurement. He did several manipulation checks. So he goes through those, and it seems like the treatments essentially worked. The treatment priming neighboring African countries worked the way he intended, the one with the West a little less, but then in discussing why not, that was quite useful theoretically. No spillover contamination. And again, talking through different theoretical reasons why we might have seen the null findings, having to do with maybe something about repeated messaging would do better. And then in the end, Ugandans don't seem to have really seen the neighboring countries as so much as an in-group that whose attitudes they should perhaps look towards on this issue. So I think both in terms of whether you put a report out onto the internet in some form that you're not interested in publishing in a journal, or even if you do, have good luck publishing this in a journal, and that this framework is quite useful and And that's what we wanted to show with these examples. Here, I wanted to talk a little more about a norm in social sciences around this reporting and how that might work. Because even making it easier to report these results with these sorts of short reports isn't ultimately going to solve the time and reputation cost that Anna already talked about. So one way in which this might move forward is if research communities like labs, departments do create their own standards to try and set expectations that this is something worth doing. I think we've already seen this step and several of the other steps I'm talking about here adopted for pre-analysis plans, which is what gives us some optimism that this actually could catch on despite the time and reputation costs. For instance, has done this, writing guidelines about pre-registered studies needing to post results online, regardless of what the outcomes are and regardless of whether they're published. And there is a section on the website for this. We also think large funding organizations could help to incentivize reporting. So people who win awards, it could be required that at some point, and obviously you'd want a probably fairly long grace period here, but at some point, you need to put a summary online of what the results are that you found, even if you're not moving forward with publication. And if you don't do that, maybe there could even be some sort of sanctioning. Perhaps you're not allowed to apply for a year, whatever it might be. And of course, there could be exceptions made if there's evidence that you're moving forward in the publication process or trying to submit, even if it's not going anywhere at the moment. We also see a lot of potential here for repositories like OSF or AEA to help out here. So it would be fairly simple. And a few years ago, we even talked to people who work for these organizations about this, and they agreed that it would be feasible to add fields on the site where you could go back after implementing the study and just write a very brief summary of what you found. And perhaps this wouldn't even need to go into details to be useful, which then would hopefully not undermine your chances of getting it published. It could just be highlighting whether you found results as expected or not, based on the hypotheses in the pre-registration. So again, as with funding organizations, there could be time requirements here, exceptions for publication evidence, and potentially even sanctions for noncompliance, although I think for here, that's probably less relevant. This sort of reporting probably will work best with experimental research, which is potentially a limitation of what we're talking about. But it seems like, at least in terms of where to start, this would be a good community for which to do that. And one advantage of this also is these repositories are searchable. Already, I think people go to them to look to see what has been done on, or what is being done on topics they're interested in. But if you added this kind of summary field at the end of these pre-analysis plans, then it might make it easier to find this sort of reporting rather than people just putting these randomly on their websites or different departmental websites, et cetera. So it might give some centralization that just makes it easier to find the reports when they're put up. So I'll just wrap up here with some reflections of my own a few years into this. So first, one, I think, issue that's come to my mind as I've moved into an assistant professor job and started trying to think longer term a bit about bigger projects with multiple pieces, multiple surveys across multiple years. How do you approach findings that may be null that you put on hold because you think next year I'll run another replication, see what happens, maybe an extension, but eventually perhaps you get to the point where those findings get lost or you move on to other projects. I think it's reasonable to think there should be some delay here where people can take their time, but at the same time, then some of the benefits of what we're talking about in terms of reporting do potentially get lost. And then are we underestimating the opportunity cost here, even with this brief reporting model, 5 pages or less, pulling pieces from pre-analysis plans that you might already have? It still takes time. And so perhaps there are ways to incentivize scholars to take that time, but we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as to whether this seems worth it, given that it probably would still take a day or a good chunk of a day to pull one of these together. And for professors and researchers who are extremely busy, is that simply expecting too much? So I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. And we're keen to hear your comments.
Thanks for your talk. It was super interesting. I work a lot in sort of the replicability, replication type world. And of course, we have the same problem because if you go to the effort of doing a replication, your net career benefit is essentially negative. One of the things that we have going for us, though, is champions, one of whom is Abel Brodeur, who I hope Allison will invite to speak at some point from the Institute for Replicability. And what they do is to claw back some of that net negative benefit is they take a bunch of replications and publish them as a meta-analysis of sort of replications. And I think you could do the same thing with this null results framework that you've built, would be to have somebody coordinate, like the one I've got coming out has 118 authors on it because it's a replication of sort of 40 papers. And if you had somebody who was willing to take that coordinating role and publish a meta-analysis of null results in a given field, I think you can circumvent the need to build a brand new journal by making something really valuable for an existing journal and minimizing the burden on a collective of authors while maximizing the burden on somebody who's going to be a champion. So just your reaction to that.
Thanks a lot. This is a really intriguing idea. I hadn't personally thought of that before. I like it a lot. I think there's definitely a lot of potential here. I think my slight immediate concern for now is like, how do we identify the people, right? Because at least in terms of replication, at least the way I'm used to seeing it is the articles are published, journals have a link to the data and code, and then you can identify the papers you want. In terms of null results, I'm not sure how to identify the full set of null results that's out there. I think maybe potentially we did the notches thing on the American Economic Association just because we thought there would be a lot of experiments on the same, because not just it's across many different disciplines and so on, but these many experiments on the same thing. Maybe one idea is simply to contact the 40 people who didn't publish. So there's potentially something here, but I'm not sure how else to do it, like across, many other types of topics. But yeah, it's a really intriguing thought. I'd like to think a bit more about it, but it's a really good idea.
It could be, a Sandlot type thing, right? If you build it, they will come. Because I think some people do really they'll spend a year and a half coming up with something. And if they think it's just going to sit idle, regardless of whether they push forward with the project, they won't do anything with it, of course. But if there is an institute rather than a journal of null results, an institute of null result reporting or something where they can submit a 4-page or 5-page, whatever your framework is, result, and maybe nothing comes of it. They're doing something so niche that there just isn't an opportunity to do a meta-analysis of it. But if someone's looking and going through, and maybe in a couple of years, the payoff is, okay, now I'm in the American Journal of Political Science in a meta-analysis of findings that were done on third-party candidates or whatever. And now I've got a top field publication out of this for very little effort on my part. It's something worth considering.
If I could just also jump in. Yeah, thank you. I like the suggestion. And I do think it might be possible to at least get an example started by using our networks, reaching out to people, asking if they have null findings they're sitting on, suggesting that they write these reports, and then on the basis of we will do a meta-analysis incorporating them once you give them to us. So I think I could see a way in which we could get that off the ground, even as an example of how it could work.
And I have a couple of thoughts along the same line as Grant's. One is that, of course, the start of the response to the response of research data management came from these replication crises and this recognition of the issues with knowledge development within various fields. And it does strike me that in some ways this needs a good crisis for people to really understand. And I was super intrigued by what might be in those 40 researchers who didn't publish around nudges, and seeing that as a relatively small, relatively easy thing to see if there's a there. If you could actually say something meaningful about a very popular topic by being able to understand if there are null results that are buried, and not lose the potential of empirics in this to be able to make the case for why it's important. And the other thing that I was struck by in this was the implications for systematic reviews. And that certainly in Canada, within social sciences, systematic reviews are growing significantly as an approach. There's not consistent pre-registration, of course, across projects, but it would be interesting if a handful of systematic reviews made as part of the process, they were also going to review pre-registrations, and they were also going to contact authors that didn't publish and not only take what was given in what was actually published or do web searches. I don't know how that would work functionally. I think there's a lot that would need to be worked out about how to do that. But it seems like that's another way to be able to begin to make the case that this matters.
Yeah. And again, I think the fact that we do have these pre-registration repositories where we can see that this work has allegedly been done and is not anywhere would give you somewhere to start in terms of finding people to nicely ask that they share the outcomes of their studies in a way that would benefit a meta-analysis.
But I like everything that's been said so far. And in terms of maybe like doing a follow-up study where we find out now among these 40 studies what happened to them. Maybe some of them have been published since or are working papers, some aren't, and then actually trying to contact the authors. And then in terms of, I haven't done any systematic reviews myself that I published, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense to not only look at published papers, but at pre-registrations. It seems it should be really a requirement in my view, just to, again, if you agree that the published research is biased, then it's really important to look at also the pre-registered research. Yeah.
Sam, do you have a comment or question?
Yes, thank you for the great talk. I know near the end you discussed a little bit the places where the null result reports had been published. I was wondering where you had published the null result reports from the IPL lab, and if you thought there was maybe any value in publishing these reports on a central repository that's indexed in academic search engines. Thinking of something like NBR working papers that come up alongside published papers. Yeah, your thoughts on that.
Do you want to take that or do you want me to start? Okay. Yeah. So the IPL, the report that I talked about briefly in the presentation, I believe that's on the IPL website. It's also on our websites, or at least mine. So it should be searchable and found there. But one thing we had talked about doing was encouraging people to post these on actual working paper repositories as well, because then it would be easier to find them, easier to cite them. So I agree that would be a good step. And I think I'm forgetting the one that I think we did that. I'm forgetting the one we used though. Do you remember?
So I think we may not have, okay, on the IPL website now, we decided to add a section for null results, right? If you look at like publications, there are articles and books, there's working paper series, and then there's a null results series. So I think this was like the main change we did there. So there's like the Georgian report, and then there's another report that we use as an example. They're part of the appendix to the political analysis plan. So I think that's why we didn't have them as a separate publication, because they're already in a peer-reviewed journal in this appendix. But I think ideally what always one of these repositories would have is another section that would have like all of these reports indexed as well. Yeah.
Okay, I know we are out of time. Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting and exciting conversation.
Thanks for the comments.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting us. We really appreciate this.
Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Take care.